Do you believe in destiny? If you answered no, prepare to be challenged. Most people think Viking mythology is just a bunch of stories about strong, barbaric gods in a land of ice. But what if I told you that behind all the glory of Valhalla and the power of Thor, there was a dark belief that all the gods, including the mighty Odin, were doomed to die, and that they knew it? It sounds crazy, but it's the absolute truth. And most interestingly, death wasn't an end, but a beginning. Did you know that Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, wasn't a weapon of final victory, but a symbol of a struggle destined to end in defeat? In this video, we'll delve into the story of the gods' demise. We'll unravel the story of their rise, their battles, and their tragedies. We'll touch on the wound of the loss of an entire pantheon and show how this loss actually paved the way for a new era. You'll understand why the Norse faith wasn't about the hope of victory, but about the honor of facing defeat. And in the end, you'll discover how a people who believed in the apocalypse created one of the most resilient and fascinating cultures in history. So, if you want to discover why the Vikings didn't fear death but embraced it with honor and understand the true story behind the epic Ragnarok, stay with us. And if you enjoy this journey through Norse mythology, consider liking and subscribing to the channel and leave a suggestion for the next video. Your subscription and like help spread knowledge about these incredible stories. Turn on the bell to not miss future videos and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Your participation is essential for us to continue exploring humanity's great sagas. Before long ships tore through the waves of the North Sea and the Norse war cry echoed off the shores of Europe, Scandinavia was a place of harsh winters and short summers, where life followed an ancient rhythm dictated by the earth and the sky. The popular image of the Vikings as tireless raiders, sailing in search of gold and glory, obscures the reality for many centuries. Most Scandinavians were farmers and fishermen, living in small rural communities and tribal settlements, deeply connected to the land that sustained them. Families grouped into clans, and these clans in turn formed larger tribal societies ruled by local chiefs. Life was a constant struggle against the elements, plowing the frozen land, herding livestock, and hunting to survive the long months of darkness and cold. Wealth was measured not in gold coins, but in the fertility of the land, the strength of the livestock, and the unity of the clan. Houses made of wood and clay sheltered entire families, with the hearth at the heart of the hearth, serving as the gathering place for meals, storytelling, and the passing on of traditions. Religion, in this setting, was a direct reflection of this life connected to nature. There was no grand temple system like in Southern Europe, nor an organized priestly class. Instead, faith was lived and practiced in everyday life. The gods were not distant figures, but active forces in the world, capable of being influenced or appeased. Worship was performed in sacred places in nature, such as groves of ancient trees, mountains, and lakes, or on improvised altars in homes. It was believed that the spirits of the land, the Landvator, inhabited these places and needed to be respected to ensure good harvests and the protection of the clan. This ancient faith was deeply animistic, seeing the divine in everything. Every tree, stone, and spring had its own spirit. Magic, or cider, was practiced to predict the future, cure illnesses, and influence events. This practice, often associated with women, the Valvas, was a vital element in society, offering a direct link to the spirit world. Life was a continuous cycle of sowing and harvesting, of birth and death, and Norse religion reflected this circularity. Deities were honored in seasonal festivities, such as Yule at the winter solstice, to celebrate the return of light. Animal sacrifices, known as BLT, were made to ensure the gods' benevolence. Life, though hard, was permeated by a sense of community and a faith that gave meaning to the challenges and rewards of existence. This was pre-Viking Scandinavia, a world that, though peaceful compared to what was to come, already contained the seeds of a culture of honor, bravery, and deep faith that would shape one of the most dramatic periods in history. Viking religion, as we know it today, is a complex tapestry woven with threads of myth and reality. To understand its essence, it is crucial to separate concrete religious practice, the people's daily beliefs and rituals, from the rich mythological stories that have come down to us. The Icelandic sagas and Eddas, written centuries after the end of the Viking Age, are the primary source of our knowledge of the gods and heroes. However, these works were compiled and, to some extent, edited by Christian authors, who sought to preserve their people's cultural heritage, but inevitably viewed the pagan world through a new lens. The stories of Odin and his quest for knowledge, Thor and his epic battles, and Loki and his mischief were, at their core, didactic and entertaining narratives. They were told on cold nights around the hearth, passed down from generation to generation, shaping the morality and worldview of the Norse. They explained the origin of the universe, the cycle of the seasons, the reason for war, and human nature. Myth served as a tool for understanding the world, but it did not always accurately reflect how the gods were worshipped. For most Norse, faith was much more pragmatic. It was about ensuring the protection of the home, the fertility of the land, and safety on a sailing voyage, while mythology painted a grandiose picture of gods battling giants. Everyday religion focused on the veneration of specific gods for specific needs. A farmer might offer a sacrifice to Frey, the god of fertility, to ensure a good harvest. A seafarer might ask for protection from Ingjerd, the god of winds and navigation. Thor, with his hammer, was the protector of Midgard, the human world, and his hammer was a common amulet worn to invoke his protection against the forces of chaos. Popular belief was that these gods actively intervened in people's lives. Religion was more than a series of stories, it was a way of life. Rituals such as the BLT were communal, strengthening social bonds. Tribal chiefs, or Gothi, acted as religious and political leaders, organizing celebrations and mediating conflicts. The absence of a formal clergy and a centralized doctrine allowed for a more personal and flexible faith. What was believed in an isolated valley in Norway could differ subtly from what was practiced on an island in Iceland. The distinction between fact and myth also manifests itself in the concept of fate or word. The Vikings believed that events were largely predestined, woven by the Norns, the spinners of destiny. This belief did not lead to fatalism, but to an attitude of facing fate with courage and honor. Myth shaped this idea, but it was religious practice that guided actions to influence fate favorably through offerings, rituals, and a virtuous life. The beauty of the Norse faith lies in this duality, the grandeur of the myths that inspired it and the practicality of the beliefs that sustained daily life. For the Norse people, the sound of thunder was not just a meteorological phenomenon. It was the thunderous echo of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, striking the skull of a giant. The hammer was not just a weapon, but a symbol of power, protection, and fertility, embodying the spirit of Thor, the most popular of the Norse gods. In a world where natural dangers and the threats of giants were a constant reality, Thor was the tireless protector, the champion of the people of Midgard. His popularity surpassed that of his own father, Odin, for he was a closer, more tangible god, whose actions directly benefited everyday life. The myth of Mjolnir is a fascinating story of deception and craftsmanship. Legend has it that Loki, in one of his pranks, cut off the hair of Sif, Thor's wife. To appease the god, Loki promised to obtain new golden hair and, on his journey, challenged the dwarves, master blacksmiths, to create 3 treasures for the gods. The dwarves Sindri and Brokkr forged Mjolnir, but a small error by Brokkr caused the hammer's handle to be too short. This imperfection, however, did not diminish its power. The hammer returned to Thor's hand after being thrown and had the ability to shrink to fit within his tunic. More than that, Mjolnir was the instrument through which Thor controlled thunder and lightning, and was a relentless enemy of the frost and rock giants. The popularity of Thor and his hammer was reflected in the daily lives of the Norse. Amulets shaped like Mjolnir were found in excavations throughout Scandinavia, worn by men and women as protective talismans. They were symbols of strength and resistance against chaos. Even with the arrival of Christianity and the cross becoming a common symbol, many people wore the 2 amulets together, a practice that demonstrates a reluctance to completely abandon the ancient faith. Thor's figure was simple, direct, and honorable. He was the opposite of the cunning Odin and the trickster Loki. He was a god of action, not intrigue. When a giant threatened the order of the cosmos, Thor wielded his hammer without hesitation. His strength was immense, and his rage legendary. In one of the most famous stories, he disguised himself as a bride to retrieve Mjolnir, which had been stolen by the giant Thrym, demonstrating not only his strength but also a rustic sense of humor and determination. Thor's hammer was more than a divine weapon. It was the manifestation of the Norse belief in the victory of order over chaos, of strength over anarchy. It was the symbol of the protector who was ever present, ready to defend the realms of gods and men. The story of Mjolnir resonates with the Viking culture of honor, strength, and resilience, and reminds us why Thor, more than any other god, became the face of the Norse faith. If Thor was the beating heart of Norse faith, the tireless protector, Odin, was its mind, soul, and spirit. A complex and multifaceted god, patron of war, poetry, magic, and, above all, knowledge. His quest for wisdom was not a leisurely pursuit, but a feverish obsession, driven by the knowledge that knowledge was the key to understanding the fate of the universe and, perhaps, even to altering it. The title Allfather was no mere formality. He was the leader of the Asir gods, the architect of cosmic order, and his actions, however extreme, were aimed at protecting and sustaining the world. Odin's quest for knowledge is at the heart of his mythology. His most famous journey took him to the well of Mimir, a source of wisdom located at the root of Yggdrasil, the world tree, the guardian of the well. Mimir did not give up his knowledge easily. He demanded a price, and Odin, without hesitation, made the ultimate sacrifice. He tore out his own eye and threw it into the waters of the well. The physical loss was nothing compared to the reward he received: a drink of the water that gave him unparalleled knowledge of the past, present, and future. This act of self-mutilation was not a sign of weakness, but of unwavering determination. The sacrifice of his eye is one of the most powerful myths in Norse mythology, symbolizing that wisdom and enlightenment can only be achieved at great personal cost. Odin's quest, however, did not stop there. In another of his endeavors to acquire knowledge, he hanged himself from the world tree itself, wounded by his own spear, Gungnir. For 9 nights and 9 days he remained hanging, observing the 9 worlds and the depths of the universe. It was during this period of sacrifice and suffering that he discovered the runes, the magical symbols that held the secrets of creation and destiny. No one gave me bread or horn. I looked down and caught the runes with a cry and fell back from where I started, says a verse from Havamel, the Song of the Most High, which records Odin's words. Odin, therefore, is a figure of contradictions, a leader who humbles himself in search of knowledge, a god of war who values poetry, a master of magic who submits to pain. His complexity made him a fascinating god, worshipped by kings, poets, and warriors. He was the lord of the dead in battle, welcoming the bravest into the halls of Valhalla, and the patron of shamans and sorcerers, who sought to master the magic he himself had conquered. Odin's journey for wisdom is humanity's own journey in its search for understanding, a quest that demands sacrifice and courage. For the Norse warrior, life was a constant battle, and death was a passage to the next stage of existence. But this was no ordinary death. An honorable death in combat, wielding a sword, was the pinnacle of a life dedicated to courage. This belief, which both fascinated and terrified his enemies, was fueled by a promise that resonated throughout the Viking world: the promise of Valhalla. For the Norse warrior, there was no greater glory than perishing in battle, for this was the only path to an honorable destiny, to be chosen by the Valkyries, Odin's servants, and taken to the Hall of the Dead in the realm of Asgard. Valhalla, the Hall of the Dead, was Odin's abode, a grand and eternal place where the fallen warriors, the Einherjar, prepared for the final battle of Ragnarök. Described in the sagas, the hall had 540 gates, through which 1,000 warriors passed at a time. Its walls were lined with shields, and its ceiling was covered with spears. It was a place of feasting and preparation, where warriors spent their days fighting and killing each other in training battles, only to be revived at night to feast on boar and mead served by the Valkyries. This belief in an afterlife was a driving force behind Viking behavior. The idea that cowardice was the greatest dishonor and courage the greatest virtue shaped society in the warrior mindset. It was preferable to die heroically than to live a long, inglorious life. Death by illness or old age, on the other hand, led to a less glorious afterlife in the dark realm of Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel. While Helheim was not a place of eternal torment like the Christian hell, it was a cold and monotonous place, lacking the glory and camaraderie of Valhalla. The cult of honorable death manifested itself in rituals and social practices. The funerals of great warriors were grandiose, with burial ships and tombs filled with objects that would serve the warrior on his journey. Death was seen as a rite of passage, and faith in Valhalla offered a form of transcendence, where the warrior could continue to serve the gods and himself. The promise of Valhalla was essentially a celebration of human bravery. It gave meaning to the violence of Viking life and transformed death into an opportunity for eternal glory. It was a belief that fueled the audacity of a people who ventured into unknown seas and confronted empires. The story of Valhalla is an invitation to reflect on what humanity considers the greatest honor, and reminds us that for some cultures, the greatest gift is not longevity, but courage in the face of the inevitable. At the heart of the Norse cosmos stood an all-sustaining structure, a living, imposing entity, Yggdrasil, the world tree. More than a simple tree, Yggdrasil was the universe itself, an intricate web that connected all 9 worlds, each with its own essence and purpose. Its deep roots and branches stretched across all creation, connecting the realm of the gods with that of the giants, the dwarves, and the mortals. Yggdrasil served as a cosmic map, a central axis that organized the complexity of Norse mythology. Its 3 main routes extended to different worlds. The first route reached the well of Mimir, in the land of the frost giants, where Odin sought wisdom. The second route plunged into the well of Ured, where the Norns, the spinners of fate, lived and tended the tree, watering it with sacred water to keep it green and strong. The third route reached the realm of the dead, Helheim. The 9 worlds suspended or connected by Yggdrasil were Asgard, the realm of the Asir gods, where Odin, Thor, and other warrior gods lived. Vanaheim, the home of the Vanir gods, deities of fertility, wisdom, and nature. Alfheim, Olardos Elfos de Luz, Seers Eterios, Ibelos. Midgard, the world of humans, surrounded by a vast ocean, where the serpent Jarmungandr lay. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, the primordial enemies of the gods. Nitvellir, Svartalfheim, the underworld of the dwarves and dark elves, masters of metallurgy. Niflheim, the world of ice, mist, and darkness, where Helheim was located. Muspelheim, the realm of fire, inhabited by the fire giant Surtur. Helheim, the realm of the dead, where those who did not die in battle went. The world tree was not a static place. It was full of life and movement. A wise eagle nestled atop its branches, while a dragon, Nidhogg, gnawed at its roots at its lowest point. A squirrel, Ratatosk, scurried up and down the trunk, hurling insults back and forth between them. The constant threat to the tree's balance symbolized the perpetual tension between order and chaos in the universe. Yggdrasil was more than a mythological concept. It was a representation of Norse cosmology. It depicted an interconnected world where actions in one realm could have repercussions across all others. The health and survival of Yggdrasil were crucial to the existence of all. When the tree trembled and the threats became insurmountable, it would signal Ragnarök, the end of times. The universe of Yggdrasil, therefore, offers us a vision of a vibrant, dangerous, and interconnected cosmos, where the struggle for existence is eternal. Before there were gods, giants, or men, there was only a primordial void, a formless abyss known as Ginnungagap. It was a place of nothingness, a space of silence and darkness, flanked by 2 opposing extremes. To the north, the icy realm of Niflheim, and to the south, the fiery realm of Muspelheim. This duality, this meeting of extremes, would be the catalyst for creation. Norse mythology, in describing the birth of the universe, resorts to a poetic and powerful vision of order emerging from chaos. From the north of Ginnungagap, the biting cold of Niflheim emanated. The realm was a mist of ice and mist, from which rivers of glacial water, called Ilivagar, flowed into the void. From the south, the intense heat and sparks of Muspelheim spread. Muspelheim was guarded by the fire giant Surtur, who wielded a flaming sword, and his essence was pure destruction and heat. For eons, ice and fire have been at one with each other. When the frozen waters of Niflheim met the scorching heat of Muspelheim, the ice began to melt. And where heat and cold fused, life began to manifest. This meeting of extremes created not a paradise, but the first living being, the primordial giant Ymir. Mythology describes Ymir as a being of duality, born of ice and nourished by heat, the progenitor of all frost giants. Likewise, from the melting ice, the cosmic cow Audumbla emerged. While Ymir fed on Audumla's milk, the cow, in turn, licked the salty ice blocks. From her tongue, a humanoid being slowly emerged, first the hair, then the head, and finally the body. This being was Biri, the grandfather of Odin, Vili, and Via, the first gods. Creation, therefore, was not the act of a single divine being, but the result of a cosmic process where life flourished from the friction between opposing forces. The story of Ginnungagap, the meeting of ice and fire, is a metaphor for the very nature of the Norse universe. It is a story of tension and balance, where order and chaos are in constant conflict. Creation was not perfect. It was marked by violence from the beginning, with the struggle between giants and gods that would define the history of the cosmos. This vision of creation, where life arises from extremes in conflict, reflects the harsh reality of life in Scandinavia and the mindset of a people who understood that survival required resilience and the ability to forge something new from what already exists. The Norse universe did not begin with a harmonious creation, but with the birth of a being whose essence was chaos. From the melting ice in the abyss of Ginnungagap, the primordial giant Ymir emerged, a being so vast that the entire world that would come to exist could be made from his body. Norse mythology, in its brutal and pragmatic vision, presents the giants, or Jotun, as the first life form, ancestors of all beings, including the gods themselves. The origin of giants, according to legend, is as chaotic as Ymir. While he slept, sweat welled up in his armpits, and from this sweat a pair of giants, a man and a woman, were born. From one of their legs and the other, a six-headed child emerged. Ymir's offspring were the very embodiment of chaos, brute, elemental beings that inhabited the void before order. Meanwhile, the cosmic cow Audumbla nourished Ymir with her milk. As the cow licked the ice, she released the first divine being, Biri. Buri fathered a son, Bor, who married Bestla, one of the daughters of a giant. From this marriage, the first three Asir gods were born, Odin, Vili, and Vi. The relationship between gods and giants was conflictual from the beginning. The origin of the gods through a union with a giantess already foreshadowed the tension that would define the cosmos. The giants represented the primordial and destructive forces of nature, while the gods sought to impose order and structure. The frost giants, the Hrimtharsur, were the most prominent, and their rivalry with the gods was constant. They inhabited the world of Jotunheim, but frequently attempted to invade Asgard, the realm of the gods, or Midgard, the world of men. It's important to note, however, that not all giants were hostile. There were wise and benevolent giants, and the line between gods and giants wasn't always clear. Loki, for example, though considered a god, was the son of a giant, which gave him his ambiguous and treacherous nature. Norse mythology, in describing this shared origin and the constant interaction between the two clans, suggests that order cannot exist without chaos, and that both are an intrinsic part of the universe. The story of the creation of the giants and their descendants is not just an origin myth. It is a foundation for the drama that would unfold in the future. The struggle between gods and giants, which would culminate in Ragnarök, the end of time, was the inevitable climax of a rivalry that began at the dawn of creation, when the giant Ymir first manifested in the primordial void. The creation of the universe, for the Norse, was not an act of divine kindness, but an act of violence. The gods Odin, Vili, and Vi, sons of Bor and Bestla, observed the chaotic universe and Ymir's uncontrolled offspring. They realized that for order to reign, the primordial giant needed to be destroyed. Thus, in one of the most fundamental and brutal acts in Norse mythology, the three brothers joined forces and killed Ymir. Ymir's murder was the event that transformed chaos into cosmos. From his gigantic, inert body, the gods created the 9 worlds. This narrative is a powerful metaphor for how order emerges from chaos through violence and transformation. From Ymir's flesh, the gods shaped the earth. From his bones and teeth, they formed the mountains and stones. From his blood, they created the seas and lakes that surround the world. Trees and vegetation grew from his hair, and his brain was thrown into the sky to form the clouds. And from his skull, the gods raised the celestial vault, supported by 4 dwarves at each of the cardinal points. To bring the new creation to life, the gods used the incandescent sparks of Muspelheim to form the stars and celestial bodies, including the sun and moon, which were placed on horse-drawn chariots. Night and day were created to bring order to the universe. The act of killing Emir also had a dramatic consequence. From her blood, a flood formed, drowning all the frost giants except one, Bergelmir, who survived alongside his wife on a ship, ensuring that the line of giants would continue and that the rivalry with the gods would not end. Finally, the gods created humanity. Finding 2 tree trunks by the sea, they transformed them into a man and a woman. Odin gave them life and a soul. Vili gave them will and intelligence. And Via gave them form and senses. They named them Ask and Imbla, the first human beings. The creation of the universe from the body of a slain giant is one of the most unique features of Norse mythology. There is no benevolent creator who creates the world out of love. Creation is an act of power and necessity, where life is forged from death and destruction. This narrative resonates with the harsh realities of life in Scandinavia, where existence required force and often violence to survive. The story of Ymir's death is the foundation of the universe, a constant reminder that order was conquered by force and that the forces of chaos are always lurking, ready to exact revenge. If the creation of the universe was violent, the relationship between the gods was no different. Norse mythology does not present a unified pantheon, but rather 2 distinct clans, the Aesir and Levanir, whose natures and domains of power complemented each other, but who, early in their existence, waged a bitter war. The Aesir, led by Odin, were gods of war, order, and magic. The Vanir, on the other hand, were older gods associated with fertility, nature, and prosperity. The conflict between them is one of the most enigmatic and pivotal events in mythology, as the resolution of the war shaped the Norse pantheon as we know it today. The war began with the arrival of a mysterious figure, Gullveig, a Vanir mage and shaman in Asgard. Her presence caused chaos and greed among the Aesir, who tried to kill her 3 times, but each time, she was reborn from the flames, unharmed. This indomitable resistance of Gullveig, or the power of gold, symbolizes the conflict between the priorities of the 2 clans. The Aesir, who valued honor and order, saw Gullveig's powers as a threat to their hegemony, while the Vanir considered her magic natural and essential. The conflict escalated rapidly. Odin threw his spear, Gungnir, into the Vanir hosts, a symbolic declaration of war. The battle was fierce and devastating, with the walls of Asgard being destroyed by the Vanir and the kingdom of Vanaheim being ravaged by the Aesir. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. The war, which seemed endless, finally reached a stalemate. Realizing the futility of fighting, the gods decided to make peace. To seal the treaty, they exchanged hostages, a common practice in Norse tribal societies. The Aesir sent Honir, a tall and indecisive god, and Mimir, the wisest of the gods, to live among the Vanir. In exchange, the Vanir sent their king, Njord, the god of the seas and winds, and his 2 children, Frey and Freya, gods of fertility and love, to live in Asgard. The hostage exchange, though initially an act of peace, had its complications. The Vanir suspected the Aesir had deceived them and beheaded Mimir. In response, Odin preserved Mimir's head with herbs and magic, keeping it as a source of wisdom. Despite this incident, peace remained. From then on, the Aesir and Vanir united, sharing knowledge and powers. Frey and Freya became central figures in Asgard, with Freya the most prominent goddess and patron of magic. The War of the Gods, therefore, was not a conflict of annihilation, but a process of unification. It united 2 clans with distinct natures, creating a more complete and balanced pantheon. The story of this conflict reminds us that even the gods needed to learn to coexist. And if this story surprised you, like it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos, and share it with a friend. Help spread knowledge about Norse history and mythology. And if you have a story you'd like to see here, leave it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Your participation is our greatest reward. If Norse mythology is a tapestry of order and chaos, Then Loki is the thread that unravels and ties it all together, a central and paradoxical figure who defies simple categorization. Although he lived and mingled with the gods of Asgard, he was not one of them by birth, being the son of the giant Farbati and the giantess Lofi. His presence in the pantheon was a constant reminder of the fine line that separated the gods from their mortal enemies, the giants, or Jotun. Loki was the personification of change, deceit, and ambiguity, a troublemaker who was often the only one capable of solving them. Loki's nature was that of a trickster. He was cunning and charming, but also envious and volatile. His cunning was his greatest weapon. He engineered the theft of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and it was he who had to disguise himself to retrieve it, proving that his destructive actions often required solutions of his own making. His pranks were legendary. He cut off the golden hair of Thor's wife Sif, but then ensured the creation of magical treasures for the gods, including Thor's hammer. He tricked the builder of Asgard's walls, saving the gods from an unfavorable deal. But he was also responsible for one of the darkest events in mythology, the death of Baldur. Loki's ambivalence is crucial to understanding Norse mythology. He wasn't purely evil in the Christian sense. His wickedness was more like a force of nature, a personification of chaos that tested the limits of divine order. His actions, though often cruel, served to reveal the weakness of the gods, to test their courage, and to lead to events that otherwise wouldn't happen. He was a catalyst for drama, a driving force behind the narrative. Without Loki, the story of the gods would be a sequence of predictable events. With him, the plot becomes unpredictable and full of twists and turns. His dark side was most fully revealed in events such as the death of Baldur, the god of light. Loki, driven by envy, tricked Baldur's blind brother, Char, into throwing a mistletoe dart, the only thing that could harm the invulnerable god. Baldur's death was a turning point, a tragedy that exposed Loki's true destructive nature. And although he tried to redeem himself, his actions had already sealed his fate. He refused to mourn Baldur, preventing his return from Helheim, and in an assembly of the gods, he insulted them all, revealing his secrets and weaknesses. Loki is therefore more than a villain. He is a mirror figure, reflecting the flaws and contradictions of the gods. His neither fully god nor fully giant nature makes him a vital link between the two realms, a constant reminder that order and chaos are two sides of the same coin. His story is a warning about the nature of deception and the consequences of power without responsibility. Loki's complex nature manifested itself literally in his children, who were not divine like the other gods of Asgard, but rather creatures of power and destruction, born of his union with the giantess Angrboda in Jotunheim. These three beings, the wolf Fenrir, the world serpent Jormungandr, and the underworld goddess Hel, embodied the chaos and dark prophecies that would haunt the future of the Norse pantheon. Their existences were portents of Ragnarök, the end of times, and their story is one of the most dramatic chapters in mythology. When the gods learned of these children, they were terrified. An ancient prophecy revealed that Loki's offspring would bring great evil to the universe. Odin, in an effort to contain the chaos, ordered the three to be brought to him in Asgard. The first of the children to be noticed was Fenrir, a wolf of colossal size, growing alarmingly larger by the day. His ferocity and power became so great that not even the strongest gods dared approach him. Fearing that Fenrir would become an uncontrollable threat, the gods attempted to imprison him. 2 chains were easily broken by him, but the third, forged by the dwarves with the magic of impossible elements such as the sound of a cat's foot and the breath of a fish, succeeded in binding him. The story of Tyr's sacrifice to bind the wolf is a separate episode that details the courage and the need of the gods to sacrifice themselves for order. The second creature was Jormungandr, a serpent so vast that, when thrown by Odin into the sea surrounding Midgard, it grew large enough to bite its own tail, enveloping the world of men. It was the silent and menacing guardian of the universe, and its presence posed a constant threat to humanity. Prophecy foretold that when it released its tail, the world would be in danger. The rivalry between Jormungandr and Thor was legendary, with the two facing off in epic battles, including Thor's famous fishing attempt, where he nearly pulled it from the sea. Finally, the daughter, Hel, was a figure of disturbing duality. Half her body was beautiful and alive, and the other half was gray and dead. Odin named her goddess of the realm of the dead, Helheim, granting her dominion over those who did not die in battle, such as those who perished from disease or old age. Though her realm was dark, Hel was not inherently evil. She was the embodiment of unheroic death, a necessary aspect of the cycle of life. Loki's children were, in essence, the manifestation of the inevitability of chaos and destruction. They represented the elemental forces that the gods tried to control, but which ultimately proved uncontrollable. The story of how the gods tried and failed to deal with them is a prologue to the catastrophe that would come at Ragnarok. Fenrir would break free to kill Odin. Jormungandr would rise to fight Thor, and Hel, from her realm, would release the dead for the final battle. The Norse pantheon was an assembly of gods of diverse natures. Tyr, the god of war and justice, was one of the most honored. His courage was not that of a warrior seeking glory, like Thor, but that of a god who sacrificed himself for order and the common good. This virtue manifested itself in one of the gods' most dangerous moments, the attempt to imprison the wolf Fenrir, one of Loki's sons of chaos. The story of Tyr's sacrifice is not only a myth of courage, but a reflection on the need to do what is right, even if the price is high. As Fenrir grew at an alarming rate and his strength became an incalculable threat, the gods decided it was time to contain him. They tried twice. First with the strong chain, lighting, and then with the even stronger one, Drami. Both were broken by Fenrir with a single movement. The gods then called upon the dwarves, the master blacksmiths, to create a chain that no one could break. The dwarves, using magical ingredients unavailable on Earth such as the sound of a cat's foot, a woman's beard, and a bear's sinews, forged Gleipnir, a ribbon as thin and light as silk, yet indestructible. The ribbon, however, would not be enough. Fenrir became suspicious of the gods, who approached him with the appearance of a game, challenging him to break the new chain. The wolf, who had already sensed the intention behind the previous challenges, agreed to be bound only if one of the gods placed their hand over his mouth as collateral. All the gods retreated, aware of the prophecy and the danger. Only Tyr, the god of courage and justice, stepped forward. Tyr reached out his right hand, the hand of law and oath, and placed it in the wolf's mouth. As Gleipnir was placed on Fenrir, the ribbon tightened, and the wolf was unable to free himself. Furious, Fenrir closed his mouth and tore Tyr's hand away. The wolf's howl echoed throughout creation, and Tyr's pain and mutilation became a symbol of his sacrifice for order. The story of Tyr and Fenrir is more than an adventure tale. It underscores the theme of responsibility. To protect the universe from chaos, the gods resorted to an act of deception, but Tyr, through his courageous act, ensured that justice was upheld. His sacrifice is proof that courage is not just bravery in combat, but the willingness to lose something precious to protect what matters most. The loss of Tyr's hand was a heavy price, but it was a price that, for a time, ensured the safety of the realms. And the story reminds us that the greatest heroes are not those who conquer, but those who sacrifice themselves for the common good. Thor's strength was legendary and feared by all giants. However, one of the most fascinating stories in Norse mythology doesn't show the god of thunder vanquishing his enemies with the power of his hammer, but rather being subjected to a series of illusions and tricks that tested not only his strength but also his patience. The story of his visit to Utgard, the castle of the giant Utgard Loki, is one of the clearest examples of the difference between brute force and cunning, and reveals a more vulnerable and human side of the god. Along with Loki and his servants, Thor traveled to the land of the giants, Jotunheim. They arrived at the grand hall of Utgard Loki, who, instead of attacking them, challenged them to prove their skills in competitions. Loki, the first to accept, competed in a test of speed in eating, but was defeated. Then, Thor, with his unshakable confidence, accepted the challenges. Thor's first challenge was to drink from a drinking horn. It seemed simple, but no matter how much he drank, the liquid barely moved. He tried 3 times, becoming embarrassed by his failure. What Thor didn't know was that the horn was connected to the world's oceans, and in his attempt, he had significantly lowered the sea level. Utgard Loki then challenged him to lift his cat. Thor confidently grabbed the cat, but even with all his strength, he could only lift one of its paws off the ground. What he didn't know was that the cat was actually the world's serpent. Jormungandr in disguise, and the fact that he managed to lift it even slightly was already a testament to his superhuman strength. Finally, the giant challenged Thor to fight an old woman. Thor, reluctant to fight an elderly woman, accepted. He tried every means to throw her to the ground, but she was unwavering. What he didn't know was that the old woman was Ellie, the personification of old age. Old age, as Loki revealed, was something no one, not even the gods, could defeat. In the end, Loki revealed to Thor that he and his companions had been victims of an elaborate deception. All the challenges were illusions designed to safely test their strength and power. The lesson was clear. Thor's brute strength, though immense, was not enough to overcome cunning and magic. The story shows us that Norse mythology is based not only on physical battles, but also on games of wit and skill. Thor's adventure in Utgard is a reminder that, even for the strongest gods, wisdom and humility are qualities as important as strength. For the Norse people, runes were much more than a simple alphabet. They were the key to wisdom, poetry, and, above all, magic. The word rune itself means secret or whisper, and the belief was that each of these symbols contained cosmic power and a direct connection to the gods. Runic magic was a fundamental practice in Norse life, used for divination, protective spells, healing, and even to influence fate. The origin of the runes, like most great quests for knowledge, is intrinsically linked to the figure of Odin. As we saw earlier, Odin hanged himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights in an act of sacrifice for wisdom. It was in this state of trance and suffering that he saw and understood the secrets of the runes. He, the god of magic, was the first to decipher them. The practice of runic magic, or cider, was highly specialized and, in many cases, was wielded by Valvas, female shamans who could see the future and influence events. The use of runes involved chanting, carving symbols into wood, stone, or metal, and imbuing them with intention. Each rune had a name and meaning, and their combination could create a powerful spell. For example, the Fehu rune, meaning cattle or wealth, was used in rituals to attract prosperity. The Alges rune, representing the elk, was used as a symbol of protection. The Vikings carved runes on their amulets, weapons, tombs, and ships. A sword bearing the rune of Tyr, the god of war, was considered more powerful in battle. A runed tombstone told the story of the deceased and ensured their memory was honored. Runes were how magic and intention manifested in the physical world. They were believed to be both healing and cursing, and knowledge of their use was considered a valuable secret. Runic magic was not seen as an external force, but as an integral part of life and the cosmos. The power of the runes was believed to come from the very nature of the universe, the 9 worlds, and the world tree. Their power was an extension of the will of the gods. The Othala rune, meaning inheritance or ancestral land, was used to protect property and family ties. Although most information about runic magic comes from sagas and poetry, the discovery of artifacts with runic inscriptions throughout Scandinavia and the British Isles confirms their importance in everyday life. Rune magic is a testament to the Norse people's deep connection to the spiritual world and their belief that wisdom and magic could be attained and used to influence reality. Norse faith was not a practice of passive worship, but an active and pragmatic relationship with the divine world. To appease the gods, ensure good harvests, victories in battle, and the health of the community. The Vikings performed sacrificial rituals known as BLT. The word BLT is linked to blood, and the practice was central to the ancient religion. The purpose of sacrifice was to strengthen the gods and maintain cosmic order, an act of reciprocity where humans gave something valuable in exchange for divine blessings. BLT rituals were usually communal, organized during seasonal festivals such as Yule, the winter solstice, and Sumarmal, the summer solstice. They took place in sacred places, such as groves of ancient trees, in clan halls, or in temples, although formal temples were rare. The ritual was led by a tribal chief, the Gothi, or a priestess. The Gigya, the most common sacrifice, was of animals. Horses, oxen, and pigs were the preferred victims. The animal was slaughtered in honor of the gods, and its blood, considered a bearer of power, was sprinkled on altars, temple walls, and even on the participants in the ritual. The animal's meat was then cooked and consumed in a great communal feast where mead and beer were drunk. The feast was as important as the sacrifice, as it strengthened social bonds and the community. The issue of human sacrifice is more controversial and less well documented. Although there are accounts of human sacrifice in Christian chronicles which can be biased, and in Icelandic sagas, which mix fact and fiction, the archaeological evidence is ambiguous. One of the most notable sources is the account of the German chronicler Adam of Bremen, who described the great temple of Uppsala, Sweden, and mentioned the practice of human sacrifice, where bodies were hung on sacred trees. Other sources mention sacrifices by kings in times of extreme crisis, as a way to appease the gods and ensure the salvation of the people. However, it's important to distinguish between what could be a rare and extreme practice, performed in moments of desperation, and regular ritual. Animal sacrifices, on the other hand, are widely confirmed by texts and archaeology. Stories of human sacrifice, such as that of Odin hanging himself on Yggdrasil, may have been myths that served as archetypes for sacrifice, without it being a common practice. The complexity of the issue of sacrifice reflects the nature of Norse religion, which was pragmatic but also deeply mystical. Rituals were how the people communicated with the divine, seeking its favor and protection. And even in a warrior culture, the belief was that sacrifice in any form was a necessary act to maintain order in a dangerous universe. For the Norse, life and death were not separate states, but parts of a continuous cycle. Belief in the influence of ancestors or Disir was as important as veneration of the gods. For them, the dead did not disappear. They became spiritual guides, protectors of the family and the land they once inhabited. Ancestor worship was a central practice in daily life, and the way the dead were treated in their graves reflected their importance to the living. Funeral rituals were elaborate and varied. For the richest and most powerful, such as chiefs and kings, ship burials or the construction of large burial mounds, higar, were common. Funeral boats, such as those discovered in Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, were considered vehicles for the deceased's journey to the other world. They were filled with precious goods, weapons, tools, and even sacrificial animals, ensuring that the deceased had everything they needed for their afterlife. Burial mounds were not just graves. They were seen as the ancestors' dwellings. Families gathered at the mounds, where they made offerings, such as food and mead, and told stories about the deceased's deeds. It was a place of communion, where the worlds of the living and the dead met. It was believed that the ancestor's power, his Hamingja, could be inherited by descendants, strengthening the clan and family. The belief was that a well-treated ancestor could be a protector, ensuring prosperous crops and safety in times of war. In contrast, a dishonored ancestor, or one who was not properly buried, could become a draugr, an undead being who haunted their family and land. The story of the draugr, present in many Icelandic sagas, served as a warning about the importance of treating the dead with respect and honor. Beyond tombs, belief in ancestors manifested itself in domestic rituals. Offerings were made to a family altar, or hof, in honor of ancestors. The names of deceased relatives were kept alive through the naming of children and grandchildren, a custom that ensured the lineage and memory of the clan continued. The importance of ancestor worship in Norse society demonstrates that an individual's identity was intrinsically linked to their family and past. A clan's history did not end with the death of its members. It continued through memory, worship, and spiritual influence. A warrior's grave was not just a stone. It was a point of power, a place where history met eternity. The death of Baldur, the god of light, was one of the most tragic and dark events in Norse mythology. His beauty and kindness were so great that all the gods and beings in the universe mourned his death. Baldur was loved by all, and his death, caused by Loki's deception, was a devastating blow to order in Asgard. The gods' grief was so profound that they decided they could not accept Baldur's fate. In an act of desperation and hope, they sent Hermod, Odin's messenger, on an impossible mission to travel to the realm of the dead to try to rescue Baldur. Hermod's quest was an act of defiance against fate. He mounted Odin's horse, Sleipnir, an 8-legged creature that could travel between worlds, and followed the road to Helheim. The journey was long and terrifying. He rode for 9 nights and 9 days through deep, dark valleys until he reached the river Gil, which separated the living from the dead. The bridge over the river, Jalarbra, was guarded by a giantess, Majid, who questioned him about his purpose. Upon learning he was searching for Balder, she let him pass, for the pounding of Sleipnir's hooves was louder than that of 5 armies of the dead. Hermod finally reached the gates of Helheim, where the goddess Hel reigned in her hall. He dismounted from Sleipnir, entered the hall, and found Balder seated in a seat of honor. Balder welcomed him joyfully, and Hermod begged Hel to let him return to Asgard. Hel, who ruled her realm with ruthless impartiality, imposed one condition. She said, "If all things living and dead weep for him, then Balder may return. But if one thing refuses to weep, he shall remain with me." Hermod, full of hope, returned to Asgard with the message. The gods immediately sent messengers to all 9 worlds, asking everyone to mourn Balder. The response was overwhelming. Gods, men, giants, animals, and even the trees and stones wept golden tears for Balder. But when the messengers reached a cave, they encountered a grim, old giantess named Thik, who refused to weep. "May Hel keep what she has," the giantess said. "I have no tears for Odin's son." Legend has it that Thik was actually Loki in disguise. Loki's deception was complete. He had caused Balder's death and now prevented his resurrection. The story of Hermod's search for Balder is one of the saddest in mythology. It reveals that fate, or word, is unchangeable, and that chaos, personified by Loki, can defeat even the greatest of hopes. Hermod's failure marked the beginning of the end. The universe, without the presence of Balder's light and goodness, began to descend into darkness that would culminate in Ragnarok. Norse mythology, full of battles and heroism, also has its moments of tragedy, and none is darker than the death of Balder, the god of light, beauty, and goodness. He was the most beloved of all the gods, and his death was the blow that sealed the fate of the pantheon and began the countdown to Ragnarok. The story of his death is a tale of deceit, jealousy, and the inevitability of betrayal, personified in the figure of Loki. The drama began when Balder began having nightmares about his own death. His mother, the goddess Frigga, fearing for the life of her beloved son, traveled throughout the 9 worlds, asking every creature, every plant, every stone, and every element to swear never to harm Balder. They all swore, and Balder became invulnerable. The gods, in their joy, played a game of throwing objects at Balder to see how they would bounce, a demonstration of his invincibility. Loki, the deceiver, watched the scene with envy and malice. Disguised as an old woman, he approached Frigga and asked if she had obtained the oath of all and sundry. Frigga confidently replied that she had forgotten to ask for only a small plant, mistletoe, as she seemed too young and harmless to be a threat. With this information, Loki smiled. He departed, took a branch of mistletoe, and made a dart. Loki then approached Char, Balder's blind brother, who was standing on the sidelines of the throwing game, unable to participate. Loki offered to guide him in his participation and placed the mistletoe dart in his hand. "Throw this toward Balder," Loki said. "I will guide you so you don't miss." Char, unaware of anything, followed the instructions. The dart flew, and because mistletoe was the only thing he hadn't sworn to, it pierced Balder's heart, killing him instantly. His panic and horror spread across Asgard. The gods, in shock, could not believe their eyes. Balder's death was not just the loss of a god. It was the loss of light and hope. And when the god of light was cremated in his burial ship, his wife, Nanna, died of grief. And even Thor, the strongest of the gods, wept. Balder's death set in motion a chain of irreversible events. His death was the first clear sign that the cosmic order was crumbling. The gods united in grief and fury. Their quest for redemption failed, and Loki's betrayal was exposed. From that moment on, the prophecy of Ragnarok became a certainty. Balder's death was the prelude to the end, a grim reminder that chaos, personified by Loki, will always find a way to subvert order. Balder's death, instigated by Loki, was the line the gods would not allow to be crossed. Loki's mischief was always tolerated, as it often brought benefits, even if indirect. But the death of Balder, the embodiment of goodness, was an affront to the very order of Asgard. Loki's act was not merely a crime. It was the consummation of his treacherous nature and the revelation of his desire to subvert the cosmos. From that moment on, Loki became a sworn enemy of the gods, and his punishment would be one of the most brutal and symbolic moments in Norse mythology. After refusing to mourn Balder and insulting the gods at a banquet, Loki fled to the mountains, building a house to hide. However, his treacherous nature betrayed him. The gods found him. Loki tried to transform himself into a salmon to escape, but was caught by Thor and a net. The gods, in their fury, offered no mercy. The punishment that followed was not just physical, but a representation of cosmic vengeance. Loki had 2 sons with his wife, the goddess Sigyn, Narfi, and Vale. In an act of cruelty that shocked even the gods, they transformed Vale into a wolf and made him tear his brother Narfi to pieces. Using Narfi's entrails, which had become as hard as iron, they tied Loki to 3 large stones. His wife, Sigyn, the only one who remained faithful to him, stood by his side, holding a bowl to collect the venom of a serpent that was placed on his head. Each time the serpent dripped venom onto his face, Loki writhed in agony, and his tremors were so violent that the earth shook, causing the earthquakes we know today. Sigyn, in an act of love and devotion, strove to collect the venom in the bowl. But each time the bowl filled and she had to empty it, the venom dripped onto Loki's face, and he screamed in pain. The punishment was eternal, an endless torment, and a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. Loki's imprisonment was not just a punishment, it was a prophecy. He would remain bound until Ragnarök, the end of time, when the chains would break and he would be free. He would march into the final battle alongside the giants, leading the forces of chaos against the gods of Asgard. The story of Loki's imprisonment is one of the darkest moments in Norse mythology, a tale of betrayal, revenge, and pain. It is the promise that chaos, though contained, cannot be annihilated, and that he will return to reclaim what was denied him. For the Norse people, the history of the universe was not an endless cycle of renewal, but a drama with a tragic and inevitable ending. This ending, known as Ragnarök, the fate of the gods, was the culmination of all the tensions and conflicts that had been building since the dawn of creation. Ragnarök would not be a surprise. It would be preceded by clear signs, the first and darkest of which would be Fimbulvetur, the winter of winter, a prophecy of 3 continuous winters without a single summer of sunlight. The Fimbulvetur would be a winter so severe that the world would be covered in snow and ice. The winds would howl with hurricane force and darkness would reign. Hunger and misery would lead to conflict and war among men, and the bonds of family and clan would be broken. Brother will kill brother for greed, the prophecy said. Morality would dissolve. Humanity, in its madness, would destroy itself even before the final battle arrived. The once fertile earth would become a frozen wasteland. The story of Fimbulvetur is an allegory for the collapse of the social and moral order. Nature, which has always been a source of life, would turn against humanity, and peace, a fleeting ideal, would be replaced by total war. Fimbulvetur's vision tells us that catastrophe would not come solely from without, but that destruction would begin from within, with the loss of honor and decency. After the Fimbulvetur, the sun and moon would be devoured by the wolf Skull and Hati, who had been chasing them since the beginning of time. Darkness would fall over the universe, and the stars would disappear from the sky. The earth would be shaken by earthquakes, trees would be uprooted, and mountains would crumble. The world serpent, Jormungandr, would break free from the ocean floor, spitting venom and causing tidal waves. The wolf Fenrir, who had been imprisoned by the gods, would break free, and Loki, the deceiver, would finally break free from his chains. The vision of Ragnarök, though tragic, was not without purpose. It was the consummation of all tensions, the final resolution of the conflict between order and chaos. The gods, aware of their fate, would not flee, but would prepare for the final battle. Fimbulvetur was not merely a prelude. It was the sign that time was running out, and the promise that the great battle was approaching. The narrative of Fimbulvetur reminds us that destruction is a process, and that the end of an era does not happen all at once, but with subtle but relentless signs. Ragnarök would not be a surprise. Prophecies had spread for ages, and the gods, in their wisdom, knew the end was approaching. The signs of the end were clear and inevitable, cosmic events that would herald the beginning of the final battle. They were the physical manifestation of the collapse of order and the triumph of chaos. The first sign to shake the universe would be the howl of the wolf Fenrir as he broke free from his chains. This howl would be so powerful that it would cause earthquakes that would shake Yggdrasil itself, the world tree. Mountains would crumble, and the world would split apart. Then the universe would be plunged into darkness. The celestial wolves, Skal and Hati, who for eons had pursued the sun and moon, would finally catch up with them. Skal, who pursued the sun, would devour it, and Hati, who pursued the moon, would swallow it. Without the light of the sun and moon, the universe would be enveloped in total darkness, and the stars would fall from the sky. This moment of darkness would be the prelude to the horror that would follow. The world of men, Midgard, would also be destroyed. The gigantic serpent Jormungandr, which for eons had lain at the bottom of the ocean, coiled around the world, would release its tail. Its movement would cause colossal waves, and it would emerge to the surface, spitting venom and poisoning the land and sea. The serpent's venom would be so potent that it would burn everything in its path. Jormungandr's rise from the ocean would signal that the battle between chaos and order had begun on all levels. And from Muspelheim, the realm of fire, the giant Surtur would march with his flaming sword, ready to burn the 9 worlds. His arrival would be heralded by the crackling of fire and the smoke of his march. He would streak across the sky, and his sword would be brighter than the sun itself. The story of the signs of the end is a tale of terror and despair. It shows that Ragnarok would not be just a battle, but an event of total destruction, where nature itself would turn against gods and men. The image of Jormungandr rising from the sea and Skal devouring the sun is one of the most powerful in Norse mythology. It reminds us that no matter how strong order may be, chaos is always lurking, ready to subvert everything that has been built. As the universe disintegrated and the signs of the end manifested, a single sound would reverberate throughout the 9 worlds, a sound that would be the final call to battle and proof that the prophecy had been fulfilled. This sound would be the blast of the Gjallarhorn, the horn of the god Heimdall, the guardian of the rainbow bridge, Bifrost. Heimdall, who could hear the grass growing and the wool on a sheep, knew the moment had come. He was the first to perceive the signs and the last to give the warning. The blast of his horn would not merely be an alarm, it would be the final invitation to glory or annihilation. Heimdall, the white god, was a being of vigilance and order. He possessed the gift of foresight and knew that his destiny was tied to the end of time. He was the eternal sentinel of Asgard, and his horn was his constant companion. Prophecy foretold that when the hosts of Muspelheim and Jotunheim approached, he would blow his horn, and the sound would be heard by all the gods and all the Einherjar, the warriors of Valhalla who had been preparing for this moment for centuries. The sound of the Gjallarhorn would be the signal for the summoning. Gods like Odin and Thor would arm themselves for the final battle. The warriors of Valhalla, who died and revived every day to train for Ragnarök, would finally march. They would be led by Odin in an army of brave men, ready to fight for their kingdom and their honor. The image of these warriors, who lived and died for the sole purpose of fighting this final battle, is one of the most epic in Norse mythology. They would not fight to win. They would fight for honor, for they knew that defeat was inevitable. The Battle of Ragnarök would not be a fight of hope. It would be a fight of endurance. The gods and warriors would harbor no illusions that they could avoid the end. They would fight because it was their destiny, because honor demanded they oppose chaos. The blast of the Gjallarhorn would be the final battle cry, the call to glorious death. The story of Heimdall and his horn is a symbol of the inevitability of fate. He knew the end was coming, but he didn't shy away from his responsibility. He did what was expected of him. He raised the alarm and prepared for battle. And even though he knew he would die, he did so with honor. Heimdall's story reminds us that courage isn't just about fighting when you can win, but also about fighting when you know defeat is certain. Ragnarök would be the climax of Norse mythology, the great battle between order and chaos, where the fate of gods and giants would be fulfilled. The stage for the confrontation would be the battlefield of Vigrid, a plain so vast it stretched for 100 leagues in all directions. On one side, the army of Asgard, led by Odin, and on the other, the forces of chaos, led by Loki and the giants. The battle began with the breaking of the rainbow bridge, Bifrost, which connected Asgard to Midgard. The fire giant Surtur would march across it with his armies, and the bridge would shatter under the weight of fire and destruction. Then, the two armies would face off. The prophecies narrate the battles one by one. Odin would fight the wolf Fenrir, but would be swallowed by the beast. His son, Vr, would avenge his father's death by tearing the wolf's jaws apart. Thor would face his archenemy, the world serpent, Jormungandr, In one of the most epic battles, Thor would slay the serpent, but would be poisoned by its breath and die 9 steps after his victory. Freyr, the god of fertility, would fight the fire giant, Surtur, but would be defeated, as he had given his magic sword to his servant. Heimdall and Loki would face each other in a personal battle, and both would kill each other. Tyr, the god of war who lost his hand to Fenrir, would fight the hound of the underworld, Garmr, and both would die. The vision of the battle is one of total annihilation. None of the heroes, not even the most powerful gods, would emerge unscathed. The battlefield of Vigrid would be the graveyard of gods and giants. Victory would belong to no one. Destruction would be the only victor. In the end, the fire giant Surtur, who had marched across the Bifrost Bridge, would spread fire across the 9 worlds. The world would be consumed by flames, and the land would be swallowed by the sea. The destruction would be complete. The universe, born of fire and ice, would end in fire. The final battle is not a story of glorious heroism. It is a story of the fulfillment of destiny. The gods fought courageously, but not for a future they could save. They fought because it was their destiny, their word. Ragnarok was the final point of a cosmic drama that had been prophesied from the beginning. The story of the battle shows us that, for the Norse, the end of the world was not a punishment, but the culmination of a cycle. In the Norse pantheon, Odin, the All-Father, was the god of wisdom, magic, and war. But despite all his power and knowledge, he was not invincible. Odin's death at Ragnarök is one of the most solemn and inevitable moments in mythology. His death was an ancient prophecy, a destiny he knew he could not change. And his defeat would be at the hands of the colossal wolf, Fenrir, one of Loki's sons of chaos. From Fenrir's birth, the gods knew he was a threat. Prophecy foretold that he would grow so large that he would one day devour the sun and ultimately kill Odin. The gods were so afraid that they did everything they could to imprison him, culminating in the sacrifice of Tyr and the creation of the indestructible chain, Gleipnir. But despite their efforts, the prophecy could not be averted. Fate, or word, was something not even the gods could change. On the day of Ragnarök, Fenrir's howl would announce his release, that a chain that bound him would snap like a thread of silk. The wolf, having grown in size and power, would join the forces of the giants and Loki. The final confrontation would be inevitable. On the battlefield of Vigrid, Odin, mounted on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, and wielding his spear, Gungnir, would lead the gods and the Einherjar against the forces of chaos. The confrontation with Fenrir would be the climax of the battle. The image of Odin, the wisest and most powerful god, facing a creature he himself tried to contain, is one of epic tragedy. The wolf Fenrir was chaos itself, the untamable force of nature, and he represented the defeat of divine order. The prophecy would be fulfilled. Fenrir would open his jaws so wide that heaven and earth would touch, and he would swallow Odin whole. The All-Father, the god of wisdom and war, would meet his end in the entrails of his most feared enemy. Odin's death would be the turning point, the signal that order had been definitively broken. However, Odin's death would not be in vain. His son Vr, the god of silence and vengeance, would avenge his father. Vr had a shoe made of leather that craftsmen had cut from the remains of shoes for centuries. He would use this shoe to hold Fenrir's jaw and kill him with his sword. Vr's act was an act of revenge, but also an act of redemption, a sign that even after the god's death, the fight would continue. The story of Odin's death is a reminder that power and wisdom do not guarantee immortality. Fate, for the Norse, was the most powerful force in the universe. Odin's death by Fenrir was proof that chaos would one day triumph. The Norse apocalypse, Ragnarök, would not end with the death of the gods and giants. It would end with the total destruction of the universe. And the one responsible for this final act would be the fire giant Surtur. Surtur, whose name means the Black One or the Dark One, was the guardian of Muspelheim, the primordial realm of fire, and he was the oldest and most powerful of the giants. Since creation, he had been waiting for his moment of glory, the moment to march with his flaming sword to burn the universe. Prophecies foretold that when the signs of Ragnarök manifested and the gods and giants slaughtered each other on the battlefield of Vigrid, Surtur would move. He would not come to fight an ordinary battle. He would come to purify the universe in a sea of fire. From his realm, he would march upon the Rainbow Bridge, Bifrost, and the heat of his sword would be so intense that the bridge would shatter. His army of fire giants, the Muspelsons, would follow him, ready for destruction. Surtur's final confrontation would be with the god Freyr, the god of fertility and prosperity. Freyr, who had given his magic sword to a servant, would fight with an elk's antler. He would be defeated and killed by Surtur. Freyr's death would be symbolic, as the god of fertility and life would be killed by the personification of total destruction. Surtur's true purpose, however, was not to fight the gods. His purpose was to fulfill his destiny, to burn the universe. After the battle at Vigrid, where most of the gods and giants would already be dead, Surtur would raise his flaming sword and throw it over the 9 worlds. The fire would spread throughout creation, burning everything in its path. The world of men, the gods, the dwarves, and the giants. The land would be consumed, and the sea would evaporate. The total destruction of the universe by Surtur's fire is the logical conclusion of Norse cosmology. The world was born from the interaction of ice and fire. The world would end with the supremacy of fire. The vision of Surtur's fire is not only an image of destruction, but also an image of cleansing. The existing world, with all its imperfections and tensions, would be purified so that a new world could emerge. Surtur's fire would be the agent of annihilation, but it would also be the catalyst for a new beginning. The myth reminds us that the end and the beginning are 2 sides of the same coin. Although Ragnarok was a story of total destruction, Norse mythology did not end with annihilation. In one of the most fascinating aspects of their worldview, the cycle of life and death was not a cycle of eternal return, but a cycle of purification and rebirth. The vision of a new world rising from the ashes of the apocalypse is one of the most beautiful and hopeful in mythology. After annihilation by Surtur's fire, the earth would emerge from the sea renewed and green. Few would survive the cataclysm. 2 humans, Elef and Lifthrasir, who hid in the world tree, Yggdrasil, would survive Surtur's fire. They would be the new Adam and Eve, the progenitors of the new humanity, who would repopulate the renewed world. This vision of humanity's rebirth in a purified world is a common theme in many mythologies, and for the Norse, it was the promise that humanity, despite its mistakes, would be worthy of a second chance. Among the gods, a small group would survive Ragnarok. Vr and Vali, Odin's sons, would survive. Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, who would inherit their father's hammer, Mjolnir, would also survive. And Balder, the god of light, and his blind brother, Achar, who had died before the final battle, would return from Helheim to inhabit the new world. The reunion of Balder and Achar would be a symbol of forgiveness and redemption. The surviving gods would gather on the field of Idaval, where Asgard once stood, and find the golden tablets lost in battle, which contain the knowledge of the past and the names of the gods. The new world would be a place of peace, where there would be no more conflict between gods and giants. The eternal struggle between order and chaos would have come to an end, and a new age of harmony would begin. The vision of rebirth after Ragnarok is the turning point in Norse mythology. It shows that the end of the world is not the end of history. It is a cycle that closes, so a new one can begin. Total destruction was necessary so that the universe could be purified of its imperfections. The story of Ragnarok, therefore, is not just a tale of apocalypse, but a story of hope. The promise that even after the greatest of catastrophes, life and order will always find a way to reemerge. While Norse mythology spoke of a world rising from the ashes, in historical reality, a new force was spreading across Europe. One that would bring its own worldview and a very different pantheon. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia was a long and complex process, not a one-time affair but a gradual and often violent transition. The Norse first encountered the new religion through their great raids and trade, which brought them to the Christian lands of Europe. The Vikings, on their voyages, encountered a world of wealth and power, but also a world of faith. They plundered monasteries and churches, taking with them not only gold and silver, but also crucifixes, books, and other religious symbols that, to them, were merely exotic and curious objects. However, their contact with Christianity was not limited to plunder. Over time, the Norse who settled in the British Isles, Normandy, and other parts of Europe began to convert. Trade was also a vector of evangelization, with Christian missionaries and merchants visiting the great Scandinavian trading centers. The new religion, with its concept of a single god, heaven and hell, was very different from the polytheistic faith of the Norse. The Norse gods were imperfect and mortal, while the Christian God was perfect and immortal. The concept of Valhalla, the hall of the dead in battle, was very different from the Christian concept of heaven, which was accessible to all, regardless of their manner of death. This difference in concepts was a point of friction. The conversion was initially superficial and pragmatic. Many Norsemen converted to Christianity to facilitate trade with Christian lands or to marry into local nobility. Belief in Thor and Odin was not abandoned outright. The coexistence of both beliefs was common. The discovery of amulets combining Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and the crucifix is evidence of this syncretization. The belief was that if one god wouldn't help, the other could. However, as Christianity's political influence grew in Europe, Scandinavian kings began to see conversion as a way to centralize power and integrate into Europe's political and economic landscape. The transition, however, was resisted by many who clung to the ancient faith and traditions of their ancestors. The tensions would lead to conflict and a profound change in Norse society. The arrival of the new god was not just a matter of faith, it was a matter of power and cultural identity. One of the most striking differences between the Norse religion and the Christianity that replaced it was the absence of a formal, organized priestly caste. The pagan faith lacked a centralized hierarchy like the Roman Catholic Church, nor a professional clergy. Instead, religious leadership was closely tied to political and social power. Religious leaders were tribal chiefs, known as Gothi. The term Gothi meant priest, but their role was much broader. They were both religious and political leaders and judges. In a tribal society, authority was based on family and clan, and the Gothi was the leader of the community. He was responsible for organizing and leading sacrificial rituals, the BLT, which were community events of great importance. The Gothi was the bridge between the gods and men. He maintained the altars, made the offerings, and ensured that the rituals were performed correctly. The role of Gothi was inherited within certain families, and the position held great prestige. They were the guardians of tradition, the storytellers, and the mediators of disputes. The absence of an organized priestly caste meant that the religion was more fluid and decentralized. There was no centralized dogma or single doctrine. What was practiced in an isolated valley in Norway might be different from what was practiced in Iceland or Denmark. With the arrival of Christianity, which had a hierarchical structure and a professional clergy, the Norse religion was seen as disorganized and primitive. The Catholic Church, with its bishops and priests, offered a power structure that kings and political leaders could use to centralize their authority. The conversion of a king meant the conversion of his entire nation. The transition of religious leadership from a Gothi to a Christian priest was a fundamental shift in Nordic society. The Gothi's power was based on his connection to the clan and ancestral traditions. The Christian priest's power was based on his connection to the church and to an external spiritual authority. The Gothi's power was local, the church's power was global. The story of the Gothi is a reminder that Norse religion was deeply rooted in everyday life and social structure. It was not an abstract religion, but a practice of life, where the clan leader was also the spiritual leader, and the loss of this local religious structure was one of the first steps in the decline of the Viking Age. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia was not a peaceful process. It was marked by a profound clash of cultures, which manifested itself in violent resistance, syncretism, and, eventually, assimilation. For many Norsemen, abandoning the faith of their ancestors, the faith that had sustained their families and clans for centuries, was a betrayal. The new religion, which forbade sacrifice and venerated a single abstract god, seemed cold and distant compared to the more human and fallible gods of Asgard. Initial resistance was fierce. Christian missionaries who attempted to preach in Scandinavia were killed. The destruction of pagan temples and idols by converted kings led to revolts and civil wars. In many places, the population refused to accept the new faith, seeing it as a foreign and weak religion. The Christian God, who had died on the cross, seemed insignificant compared to Thor, the god who slew giants, or Odin, the god who sacrificed himself for knowledge. The cross, a symbol of suffering, was no match for the hammer, Mjolnir, a symbol of strength and protection. However, Christianity had advantages that the old faith lacked. The church was a wealthy and powerful institution, with a power structure that Scandinavian kings could use to centralize authority and consolidate their power. Religion also facilitated trade and alliances with the rest of Europe. Conversion became a matter of political pragmatism. Assimilation was a fascinating process. Rather than completely abandoning their ancient faith, many Norse people incorporated elements of Christianity into their own beliefs. The worship of saints, for example, could be seen as a form of ancestor worship or lesser gods. The figure of Jesus was sometimes reinterpreted as a god of war, a hero who fought against the forces of evil. Christmas itself, the Christian holiday, was syncretized with the pagan Yule, the celebration of the winter solstice. Syncretism manifested itself in physical objects. Archaeologists have found molds of Thor's hammer with a cross on one side. Bosse's silver ring in Iceland has a Thor's hammer engraved with a cross. These discoveries are proof that the transition was not abrupt, but rather a fusion of two cultures. The gradual assimilation of Christianity was essentially a form of passive resistance, an attempt to maintain cultural roots while adapting to a new political and religious reality. The history of culture clashes is a reminder that beliefs do not die easily, but rather transform and adapt. Scandinavia's transition from paganism to Christianity was not led by missionaries or a spontaneous mass conversion. It was largely a top-down process, driven by kings and political leaders who saw Christianity as a tool to consolidate their power and modernize their nations. A king's conversion was a political act, a declaration that his kingdom was joining the ranks of Christian Europe. Norway and Denmark were the first to officially convert. Harald Bluetooth, the Danish king, is often credited as the first Scandinavian king to be baptized in the 10th century. His conversion, however, was more of a political act than one of faith. He was a great unifier of his kingdom and saw Christianity as a way to legitimize his power and ally himself with the Germanic emperor. In Norway, the conversion was more dramatic. Olav Tryggvason and Olav II, both kings, used force and violence to impose the new faith. Olav Tryggvason, who had converted abroad, returned to Norway with a mission to Christianize his people, and he did not hesitate to use coercion, destroying pagan temples and forcing the conversion of local chieftains. Olav II, later canonized as Saint Olav, continued this policy, and his death in battle was seen by many Christians as a martyrdom, which helped cement Christianity as the official religion of Norway. Iceland was a unique case. Instead of violence, the conversion was decided in an assembly, the Althing, in the year 1000. The pagan leader, Thorgr Thorkelson, the Gothi and orator of the law, was tasked with deciding the matter. He retreated to his tent and meditated for a day and a night. When he returned, he declared that Iceland should adopt Christianity as the official religion, but would allow pagans to practice their beliefs in private as long as they did not make public sacrifices. This pragmatic decision avoided a civil war and allowed Iceland to convert relatively peacefully. The conversion of the Scandinavian kings was a turning point in the history of the Viking Age. It meant that the ancient faith, which was closely linked to the power and leadership of the Gothi, lost its main pillar of support. The church, with its structure and power, replaced the Gothi. The kings, in alliance with the church, consolidated their power and centralized authority, putting an end to the tribal society of ancient Scandinavia. The conversion was, in the end, an act of realpolitik, a choice to modernize and integrate with Europe. The architecture and art of Scandinavia during the transition from paganism to Christianity are a visual testament to cultural assimilation. As old beliefs gave way to the new faith, the construction of pagan temples, or hofs, was replaced by the construction of churches. But the style and symbols of the old religion did not disappear immediately. The transition was a fusion of forms and ideas, resulting in a unique style of architecture that is one of the most interesting legacies of the Viking Age. The first churches in Scandinavia, the famous stave churches, are perfect examples of this transition. They were built of wood, the traditional building material of the Norse, but their form and design were a blend of pagan and Christian elements. The interiors of these churches were dark, and the carved wooden columns could feature dragons and serpents, symbols of the ancient faith intertwined with scenes from the Bible. Pagan temples, on the other hand, were simpler wooden halls, lacking the architectural complexity of a church. They were used for sacrificial rituals, the BLT, and community gatherings. When Christianity became the official religion, many of these temples were burned or destroyed by converted kings. However, in many cases, churches were built on the same site as the old temples, as an act of power and symbolism, marking the victory of the new faith over the old. Syncretism was evident in church decoration. The doors of wooden churches, for example, were carved with scenes from Norse mythology, such as Thor's fight with the world serpent, Jormungandr. But the scene was reinterpreted as a struggle between good and evil, with Thor representing the Christian hero and the serpent, evil. The inclusion of pagan symbols was not just an art form, but a way to make the new religion more acceptable to the people, to create a bridge between the past and the future. The construction of stave churches is the story of a culture that adapted to a new reality without completely losing its roots. They are proof that the transition was gradual and that the old faith did not disappear, but rather transformed and blended with the new. The fusion of styles and symbols is a fascinating legacy of the Viking Age, a reminder that history is not a sequence of distinct events, but a continuum where the past merges with the present. Although the Norse pagan religion disappeared, its legacy survived, and most of what we know about its mythology comes from texts written centuries later by authors who were already Christians. The Icelandic sagas and Eddas, written primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, are the richest source of information about Norse gods, heroes, and cosmology. However, it is crucial to understand that these works were compiled from a perspective already influenced by Christianity. The Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson, a Christian Icelandic historian and poet, aimed primarily to preserve his people's cultural heritage so that poets could understand the mythological allusions in ancient poems. In his work, Snorri attempts to rationalize Norse mythology, presenting the gods as human heroes who came from Asia and were deified for their deeds. This interpretation, known as euhemerism, was a way of reconciling paganism with Christianity, treating the gods as kings and legendary heroes, not as deities. The Poetic Edda, on the other hand, is a collection of older, anonymous poems that appear less influenced by Christianity. However, even within it, the Christian bias is perceptible. Ragnarök, for example, the great battle that leads to the end of the world, is an apocalyptic narrative that has parallels with the Christian view of the Last Judgment. The idea of a world that dies and is reborn, with a few righteous survivors, may have been a Christian reinterpretation of a pagan myth. The fact that the legacy of Norse mythology was preserved in Iceland is in itself a historical irony. Iceland, which converted peacefully, allowed pagan culture to continue to be celebrated in poetry and prose. While converted kings in Norway and Denmark were burning books and idols, in Iceland, scholars were writing about them. The texts, while valuable, are not a faithful, unfiltered portrait of pagan faith. They are a reflection on the ancient religion through a Christian lens. The story of legacy in the sagas is a reminder of the importance of cultural preservation. What could have been lost to history was saved by authors who, despite their new faith, valued the traditions of their ancestors. The sagas and the Eddas allow us to enter a world of gods and heroes, of mystery and magic. They are proof that stories, like cultures, can survive, even if in a transformed form. The Viking Age, a nearly 100-year period that saw Scandinavia expand across Europe, didn't end with a single battle or cataclysmic event. It ended gradually, like a receding tide, driven by a series of internal and external changes. Political stabilization, the end of major raids, and the gradual loss of pagan cultural identity were the main factors leading to its decline. Political stabilization was one of the most important factors. The Viking period was largely a period of small, decentralized kingdoms. Raiding was a form of economic power for local leaders. But with the rise of powerful kings and the unification of kingdoms such as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, politics changed. These kings no longer saw raiding as a sustainable form of power. They sought to centralize control, build diplomatic ties with other European kingdoms, and establish a more stable economy. Violence and plunder, which were hallmarks of the Viking Age, became a threat to internal order. Christianity played a crucial role in this transition. As we have seen, converted kings used the new religion as a way to legitimize their power. The Church, with its structure and ties to the rest of Europe, helped solidify the authority of the kings and integrate the Scandinavian kingdoms into the continent's political and economic landscape. Conversion meant that the Nordic kingdoms ceased to be barbarians and became members of a Christian family of nations. The end of the Great Raids was a direct consequence of this shift. Trade routes became more important than plunder routes. The economy, which had previously been based on plunder, now revolved around trade, agriculture, and fishing. Viking settlements, which had been bases for raids, transformed into trading towns such as Hedeby, Birka, and York. Their contact with the outside world was constant. The loss of pagan cultural identity was a slow process. Ancient beliefs did not disappear all at once, but were gradually replaced by Christianity. The worship of Odin and Thor gave way to the worship of God and Jesus. The promise of Valhalla was replaced by the promise of heaven. Sacrificial rituals were replaced by the Mass. The ancient faith was relegated to the realm of superstition and legend. The Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, as the old culture gave way to a new one. With the end of the Viking Age and the consolidation of Christianity, Scandinavia emerged as a new political and economic landscape, fundamentally different from the tribal and pagan world that preceded it. The transition was profound, and its consequences shaped the future of the Norse kingdoms and their relationship with the rest of Europe. From that moment on, the Norse, previously seen as invaders and plunderers, became active participants in the continent's politics and economy. The kings, who were the main drivers of the conversion, consolidated their power and became absolute monarchs. The Church, in alliance with the kings, helped establish a more centralized social and legal order with laws based on Christian codes. The ancient tribal chiefs, the Gothi, lost their political and religious influence, and their roles were replaced by a new elite of nobles and clergy. Power, which had previously been scattered among clans and families, was concentrated in the hands of a few. The economy also transformed. Trade, which had previously been a minor part of the economy, became its main driver. Cities, which had been merely trading ports, became centers of political and economic power. The old economy based on plunder was replaced by one based on agriculture, fishing, and the exchange of goods. Currency became the primary source of wealth, and Scandinavia integrated into European trade routes. The Norsemen's new identity was that of European Christians. They were no longer men of the North, but Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, with a clear national and religious identity. Their names were Christianized, their laws were reformed, and their beliefs were transformed. The pride of being a pagan warrior gave way to the pride of being a Christian knight. Literature, which had previously celebrated the exploits of pagan gods and heroes, began to celebrate the lives of saints and martyrs. The story of the transition from the Viking Age to the Christian Middle Ages is the story of a people adapting to a new world. It is the story of the loss of a culture, but also the rise of a new one. The scenario that followed the conversion was not perfect, but it was one of stability and integration. The Norse, who had once terrorized Europe, now joined it.